My 4-year-old daughter, Lila, who has type 1 diabetes, was in DKA with a blood sugar level of 485 when an ER nurse tried to give her glucose tablets, something that could have killed her within hours. And the hospital? They gave the nurse a warning. That's it. Instead of firing her, I started paying attention to her closely and learned she'd been asking other nurses basic questions, like whether fruity breath meant high or low blood sugar. Turns out she had cognitive impairment and had been working 16-hour shifts, updating patient shorts from memory at the end of each one for years. When I brought Lila to the ER because she was vomiting, I thought it was just a stomach bug. She had thrown up 3 times since I'd picked her up from preschool and couldn't keep anything down. But little kids get stomach viruses all the time, right? Every time she tried sipping water, she'd vomit again within minutes, violent retching that left her trembling and in tears. Her breath had this strange, sweet scent that made my skin crawl. I kept telling the triage nurse, she's type 1 diabetic. I think her blood sugar might be really high. Can someone please check? Meanwhile, Lila was limp over my shoulder, breathing fast and shallow. The nurse on duty, this woman with long, bright teal hair and the most checked-out expression I've ever seen, sighed and said, "Ma'am, it's probably just stress. Kids these days freak out over everything." I froze. Her words echoed in my head like sirens. Just stress. My daughter's skin was pale, gray, and clammy. I'd been managing her diabetes for months. I knew this wasn't just stress. "But she's breathing quickly, and her breath smells fruity," I said, my voice cracking. "Aren't those warning signs?" The nurse rolled her eyes and started chomping her gum like she was in a teen drama. "We'll call you when a bed opens up. Go sit down and relax." I tried to take deep breaths. I even played one of those 432 hertz sound frequencies on my phone to calm down. But 10 minutes turned into an hour, 1 hour into 2, and suddenly I realized we'd been in that waiting room for 5 full hours. No follow-up, no reassessment. Lila was barely responsive. She was slipping. I kept going up to the desk, and every time the same nurse waved me off with a robotic, "Still waiting on a room." Finally, I snapped. I stood up to find a water fountain and caught sight of their whiteboard tracking screen. It listed the waiting patients in green dry erase marker. There was Lila's name. Next to it, instead of anything like emergency or room needed, it read, clear as day, "Give glucose tablets and send home." My blood ran cold. Send home? They hadn't even tested her blood sugar. I marched back to the desk. "Excuse me, but why does the board say give glucose tablets? Her sugar is high, not low. No one's even checked her yet." The nurse barely glanced up from her screen. "The doctor has already assessed her based on symptoms. He'll start fluids once a room is ready." I felt my voice tremble. "Which doctor? No one has looked at her." She finally locked eyes with me, visibly irritated. "The doctor's been monitoring all cases. Maybe you were too distracted to notice." I'd had it. I went to the charge desk and demanded, "I need the name of tonight's ER physician, right now." The clerk answered, "That would be Dr. Ho. She's with a trauma case at the moment." I positioned myself where I could see the hallway and waited. When I spotted a woman in scrubs with the right badge, I practically blocked her path. "Dr. Ho, I'm Lila's mom. Can you tell me why you prescribed glucose tablets for her?" She stopped in her tracks, looking genuinely puzzled. "I'm sorry, who? I haven't ordered anything for a patient named Lila tonight." My heart started racing. "She's 4 years old, type 1 diabetic, vomiting, fruity breath. The nurse said you ordered glucose tablets." Dr. Ho's entire expression changed. "Glucose tablets for fruity breath? Absolutely not. Take me to her now." She knelt beside Lila, checked her breathing, and her face went pale. "I need a glucometer and a crash cart immediately. This child is in ketoacidosis." I turned to look at the blue-haired nurse, who had suddenly become engrossed in her paperwork. The glucometer reading came back, 485. Dr. Ho turned to me and said, "If she'd been given those glucose tablets, her blood sugar would have spiked even more. It could have killed her within hours." "I want that nurse away from my daughter now," I said firmly. Dr. Ho nodded, and security made sure of it. They rushed Lila to the PICU that night. The doctor told me her blood had turned so acidic it was starting to shut her organs down. Giving her those glucose tablets would have been like dumping gasoline on a wildfire. The next morning, a hospital administrator came into Lila's room to apologize. She explained that the nurse had mixed up the protocols for high and low blood sugar and failed to follow proper assessment procedures. Mixed up the protocols. She nearly killed my child. And then I saw her. The nurse with the blue hair, Renee, according to her badge, walked past me in full uniform, calm as could be. They hadn't fired her, just gave her a slap on the wrist and moved on like it was nothing. That's when my mother's old words came crashing back to me. If you want something done right, you do it yourself. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of hospital visits and sleepless nights. I kept replaying that night in my mind again and again, watching the monitor beeping rhythmically beside Leela's hospital bed. The doctor said she was improving, but I couldn't stop seeing that nurse chewing gum while my daughter slipped toward death. At Leela's follow-up appointment, I turned the corner toward the endocrinology department and froze. There she was, Renee, laughing with 2 other nurses like nothing had happened. I held back, keeping a safe distance as I trailed her through the hospital's winding hallways. She stopped by the coffee machine, griped about the new scheduling system, then headed for the parking garage. I ducked behind a pillar and watched her climb into a silver Honda, one with a diabetes awareness sticker on the bumper. The irony made my stomach churn. The next day, I found myself at the pharmacy near the hospital during Renee's lunch break. I pretended to browse the vitamin aisle while she picked up a prescription. The pharmacist handed her a small paper bag, and she launched into some loud story about managing her mother's diabetes for 25 years. She actually said she could teach doctors how to manage diabetes. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the nearest bottle of magnesium, trying to look casual while memorizing every word. 3 days later, I cracked. I saw Renee in the frozen food section of a grocery store near the hospital. Before I knew what I was doing, I was walking toward her. My mouth moved before my brain could stop it. The confrontation was instant. Her face flipped from confused to combative in a flash. She raised her voice, accusing me of being hysterical and disruptive that night in the ER. People around us paused. Phones came out. I saw camera flashes in my peripheral vision. Security showed up within minutes. Renee played the victim flawlessly, dabbing at her eyes as she claimed I'd been stalking her. That night, my best friend Natalie came to my door with a bottle of wine and a look of anxiety stamped across her face. We'd been close since our college days, but she didn't settle in like usual. She just stood in my kitchen, fiddling with her wedding ring. She said Renee's mother was on the school board, the same board that had to approve Natalie's teaching transfer next month. Her husband had already landed a new job in that district. They were selling their house. She asked me, begged me to let it go, just for now, just until her transfer went through. I stared at my best friend, realizing she was choosing her future over the truth. The following Monday, I was cornered by an impossible choice. My lawyer finally agreed to take on the case, but needed the retainer immediately. At the same time, Leela's endocrinologist called with concerning lab results. We needed an urgent appointment. The schedule conflict felt like the universe mocking me. While I was picking up Leela's medical file from the nurse's station, I saw the shift schedule pinned to the break room bulletin board. Renee's name was neatly written in for evening shifts all week. I snapped a picture with my phone when no one was looking. I chose to go to Leela's appointment. That meant missing the lawyer. It also meant giving Renee time. By the time we got home, 3 voicemails were waiting. Hospital security had received a formal harassment complaint. Renee had submitted the grocery store footage, me following her through the aisles. The security officer's tone left no doubt. They'd already picked a side. The next morning hit like a tidal wave. Leela's CGM alarm went off during math class. The school called, panicking about her blood sugar levels. At the same time, my lawyer's assistant called with a final warning. The retainer had to be paid by end of day, or they'd be dropping the case. Then Isaac's name popped up on my phone screen, my ex-husband, whose voice oozed artificial sympathy as he casually mentioned reaching out to a custody evaluator over what he called my, quote, recent instability. The grocery store incident had already gotten back to him. I rushed to Leela's school, forcing every breath to stay calm, every movement to appear composed. The school nurse gave me a polite but guarded smile, explaining she'd received a hospital alert about a parent who had been harassing staff. She watched closely as I checked Leela's blood sugar and administered her insulin. Every action deliberate, every word measured.
The irony tasted sour. By keeping it together, I was giving Renee exactly what she wanted, proof that I wasn't as unstable as she'd claimed, but also validation that I had overreacted. A calm mother must have just been stressed, just like Renee had said. 2 days later, I overheard a conversation between nurses in the staff hallway. Renee had a panic attack while treating a child with diabetes. She was in the break room, surrounded by concerned coworkers who coddled her and clucked about that horrible mother who had been stalking her. They spoke like I was a danger. Renee had spun her web, and they were all tangled in it. But the betrayal that cut deepest came from Leela. One night at bedtime, she innocently mentioned the nice nurse with pretty hair who brought her a stuffed unicorn while she was in the PICU. I hadn't even noticed. It must have happened while I dozed off beside her hospital bed. Leela smiled, describing the nurse's blue hair and kind voice. She had no idea she was talking about the woman who nearly killed her. Because nothing screams medical competence quite like confusing fruity breath with a green light for a sugar rush. Renee thought my daughter was having a low. In reality, she was turning into a walking battery, her blood more acid than plasma. Honestly, the blue hair should have been my first warning that things were about to get wildly off course. Now Renee had even visited her in the PICU, planted herself in Leela's memory like a friend. School pickup became a strategy game. Hundreds of parents filled the lot each afternoon, but I spotted Renee's silver Honda immediately. It was parked 3 rows over, windows rolled down. As I moved past, pretending to check my phone, I caught sight of papers on her front seat. I leaned closer, keeping my act casual. Emails. Printed out. The subject line read, "Liability Concerns." One referenced the hysterical parent situation. My hand shook as I took photos through the window. I didn't notice the school security camera capturing me until it was too late. Renee's adult daughter, Tessa, who taught 2nd grade at Leela's school, reviewed the footage later that evening. The next morning, whispers started. Tessa told other staff that I was stalking her mother. And the story spread like wildfire. A few days later, things erupted at Leela's daycare. The director pulled me aside at drop-off, her face tight with concern. She gently explained that the center's funding renewal was pending approval and that Renee's mother had serious sway on the board making that decision. 30 families relied on this place. Her eyes pleaded with me. "Please consider the bigger picture," she said. "Think of all the children who need this care." The message couldn't have been clearer. Back off or take down the entire daycare with you. What hurt the most was my sister. She showed up unannounced and sat down on my couch like she had 5 years ago, after Dad died from that misdiagnosed heart condition. The doctors had missed obvious signs back then, just like Renee had missed Leela's. But my sister wasn't here to validate me. She was here to fix me. She brought up therapy, meds. She used soft words like pattern and obsessive, as if my justified fury was some sort of condition, as if I'd lost perspective instead of nearly losing my child. That evening, I saw the post. It appeared in the hospital's community group, usually a place for bake sales and blood drives. But this one was different. A long post venting about ungrateful parents harassing healthcare heroes. The comments section exploded. Hundreds of replies. And right there, smack in the middle of the thread, someone had posted the grocery store video. It got shared in 3 local parenting groups within hours. The comments flew fast, more than 200 by midnight, each one painting me as the aggressor, the unhinged mom, the villain. When I tried to find witnesses from that night in the ER, nurses who might back me up, every path slammed shut. I'd made a list, ready to contact them one by one. But HR got wind of it. They flagged my efforts as a harassment campaign.
The formal warning came in a crisp white envelope delivered by certified mail. It threatened legal action if I continued trying to contact hospital staff about the incident. Renee's next move was almost elegant in its cruelty. She'd swapped shifts with her coworkers to guarantee she'd be present during Lila's routine diabetes checkup at the outpatient clinic. The scheduling system even showed that her special request had been approved. And I couldn't switch doctors, not without disrupting the continuity of Lila's care. Renee had boxed me in, forcing a confrontation I couldn't avoid. Exhaustion had started to chip away at me. 3 weeks of fighting the system, documenting everything, and protecting Lila while managing her diabetes had drained my reserves. At a birthday party for one of Lila's classmates, my trembling hands accidentally drew up the wrong insulin dose. I caught the error in time, but not before the restaurant manager spotted my fumbling. Convinced I was intoxicated and endangering my child, he called 911. Even though I explained the situation, the incident was logged into the CPS database before I had a chance to breathe. Then came the final betrayal from Natalie. She sent a text, short, stiff, and cutting. Her husband had given her an ultimatum: cut ties with the unstable hospital stalker or face divorce. Natalie wrote that she still believed something had gone wrong that night, but she couldn't risk her family. The message ended with a sorry that echoed like a door slamming shut. 20 years of friendship dissolved in a few neat sentences. At the hospital, the isolation became physical. Other parents veered away in the parking lot. One mother actually grabbed her son's hand and pulled him aside as I walked past. Later that evening, I found a post in the local mom Facebook group. It was titled, "Dangerous Parent Alert." It featured a photo of me, taken from last year's hospital volunteer appreciation dinner. There were 847 comments. They picked apart everything: my behavior, my parenting, my mental health. Some even claimed to know Lila personally. Others reposted the grocery store video, tagging more parenting groups. The judgment was relentless. That's when I started documenting everything: screenshots, photos, audio recordings, copies of medical charts. My dining table vanished beneath stacks of color-coded folders. This was war, and I would not be the one who lost. Renee had the system backing her, but I had the truth. Somewhere in this pile of records was the key, something that would prove what really happened that night in the ER. She had twisted my community against me, threatened my custody, and even turned Lila's perception against me. But I had seen her confusion with my own eyes. I had tracked her contradictions, her oversights, the strange inconsistencies in how she documented patient care. I knew there were patterns in her mistakes. The battle lines were drawn, and the real war was just beginning. A month into our standoff, I found out Renee had joined the same diabetes support group my sister attended. They met on Tuesday nights at the local community center, and my sister mentioned how helpful the new woman had been. Apparently, this helpful stranger had even quoted lines from Lila's favorite book, details she could have only learned from those late-night PICU chats while I slept in that recliner beside the hospital bed. My sister didn't know who Renee was until I showed her a photo. Her face turned sheet white. Soon after, we were both summoned for police statements about the grocery store confrontation. We were separated at the station, each giving our account of what happened. A detective administered polygraphs. We both passed. Renee truly believed she was being stalked. I truly believed she had nearly killed my daughter. Two realities coexisting, each true, each impossible to reconcile. Back home, while organizing my growing wall of documentation, I found old text messages I'd sent during those awful 5 hours in the ER. Messages to friends, filled with creeping doubt. One read, "Maybe I'm overreacting." Another said, "She seems busy." Now those very texts were being used against me in Renee's defamation countersuit. My private moments of doubt from the darkest night of my life had been twisted into exhibits. Evidence of hysteria, of instability. 3 months after the incident, the custody evaluation began. Isaac had hired an elite child psychologist known for high-conflict divorce cases. During Lila's session, she told the psychologist that Mommy yells about the nice nurse all the time. She mentioned nightmares about blue hair. I later accessed the psychologist's notes during discovery. They portrayed me as an obsessive mother dragging her child into adult drama and fear. Then there was the doorbell camera footage. It showed me pacing my front porch at 3 a.m., practicing what I'd say to Renee the next time we met. I rehearsed lines, tried different tones, altered the words like I was preparing for court. Renee's attorney labeled it obsessive behavior, the product of sleep deprivation and mental instability.
The timestamp showed it had happened on multiple nights. Me pacing the porch at 3 a.m., rehearsing what I'd say if I ever confronted Renee again. In family court, my complaints about her were reframed as distractions, attempts to deflect from my own supposed negligence in managing Lila's diabetes. They pointed to the restaurant incident, where I'd nearly drawn up the wrong insulin dose. The judge asked how, if I was such a vigilant mother, I could have made such a dangerous mistake. My exhaustion from battling Renee became their evidence that I was unfit to parent. But patterns had begun to surface, right there in Lila's medical records. Her MyChart history flagged 3 appointments where dosage clarification had been required. In each instance, the attending physician had to correct a medication adjustment suggested by Renee. It wasn't a one-time error. Her confusion stretched far beyond that awful night in the ER. It was part of a consistent, subtle trend. Then I started digging into public records. I found Renee's name in the minutes from a hospital board meeting 2 years earlier. The topic? Staff retraining, following a series of unspecified incidents. The language was vague, but 5 nurses were mentioned by name. Renee was one of them. How many other families had suffered without even realizing the common thread? Even my court-mandated therapy sessions turned into ammunition against me. The therapist, required to report to the custody evaluator, documented everything, including the times I admitted to imagining Renee facing disciplinary action, losing her license, finally being held accountable. Those were supposed to be safe, healing conversations. Instead, they were weaponized, used to paint me as vindictive. I tried to gather my own evidence. One afternoon, I attempted to record Renee during school pickup. She'd volunteered for crosswalk duty, strategically placing herself right where I had to pass every single day. I kept my phone low, trying to capture how she watched me, how she lingered. But she spotted the phone instantly. She called over school security, referencing the stalking reports on file. The principal swiftly banned all recording devices during dismissal. Renee stood off to the side and smiled while the officers took my statement. That 3 p.m. pickup became a daily nightmare. Psychological warfare. Renee timed her shifts specifically to align with Lila's release. I had to walk by her each day, feel her presence, see her waving sweetly at other parents. She'd even wave at Lila, who waved back, smiling. Other parents saw my discomfort and started whispering. The unstable mom. The one who couldn't move on. Then, a breakthrough. An ICU nurse from that night finally agreed to speak with me. We met in a quiet cafe on the edge of town. She confirmed what I had suspected. She'd seen Renee hesitate, seen her write down the wrong orders. But her husband's construction company relied on contracts approved by the school board, and Renee's mother had already made veiled threats about jeopardizing that business. She looked me in the eyes and said, "I believe you. I just can't afford to say it publicly." Another voice silenced by fear, another casualty of Renee's family's reach. Even the hospital cafeteria felt like a battlefield now. During one of Lila's follow-up visits, I noticed Renee had started wearing the exact brand and color of scrubs I'd described in my complaint. She'd even added the same diabetes awareness pin she'd worn the night of the ER incident. When she passed by our table, the scent of her perfume reached Lila, and my daughter froze. Her hands started trembling, her face went pale. Other parents saw it happen, saw what that smell, that presence did to her. Renee was weaponizing trauma. A few days later, a hospital mediator contacted me. He said Renee was open to settlement talks. She'd offered to transfer departments if I agreed to drop the civil suit and issue a public statement, acknowledging I had misunderstood the events of that night. It would also require me to sign a non-disclosure agreement. When I refused, the mediator framed me as selfish, said I was putting revenge ahead of my daughter's comfort, especially since this was the only hospital in the region equipped for pediatric diabetic emergencies. But I was getting closer to the truth. In my continued research, I discovered Renee had written glucose tablet orders that night without a physician's signature. Hospital policy was clear. Any medication order required a physician's co-signature within 30 minutes. Renee's orders had no cosign, none. This wasn't about miscommunication between staff. She had personally violated protocol. She had acted outside her scope of practice. And then came another layer. Dr. Chen's voice notes from that same shift included detailed emergency protocols for diabetic cases. The log showed that Renee accessed those recordings on the hospital system, but only for 12 seconds. 12 seconds, barely enough time to register the file name, let alone absorb instructions that could have saved Lila's life. She had the tools, she simply didn't use them. And worst of all, my digging revealed she hadn't even been assigned to that case initially. Renee had been covering for Dr. Aubanks.
He'd shown up to work impaired, and Renee had been trying to juggle his patient load along with her own. Her so-called heroics, covering for a colleague unfit for duty, had pushed her past the edge. Her mistake wasn't just negligence, it was the result of cognitive overload inside a crumbling system. Renee was both victim and perpetrator, caught between chaos and control. After 4 relentless months of court battles, Isaac filed for emergency custody. He submitted Renee's character witness statement, which detailed what she called my pattern of harassment, and it didn't stop there. My own mother was pulled into the middle. She was given an impossible choice: support me and risk losing access to her granddaughter, or remain neutral. She chose the latter, and in doing so, I lost the one person I relied on for childcare during critical court appearances. Every hearing became a scramble for babysitters. Every legal motion meant more favors, more instability. Desperation drove me to the senior center where Renee's mother attended weekly programs. I enrolled in the same low-impact exercise class, trying to quietly learn about the family behind all of this. I made small talk, helped other seniors with their balance balls and resistance bands. Renee's mother often talked about her daughter's dedication, how she worked long shifts, handled difficult patients. But not once did she mention what had happened with Lila. No remorse, just pride. Through other channels, I discovered Renee's ex-husband was a gymnastics coach. I signed Lila up for classes at his center, where I overheard snippets about their custody battle over their teenage daughter, Brooke. The same patterns I saw in Renee's behavior toward me, control, manipulation, gaslighting, they had deep roots in her personal life. Her private battles mirrored our public war. More evidence surfaced from hospital records. Board meeting minutes documented 3 separate incidents involving incorrect glucose protocols, all during Renee's shifts. None were met with disciplinary action. Instead, they were logged as learning opportunities. The hospital had a culture of protection, image over accountability, staff over patience. Meanwhile, Isaac ramped up his custody demands. He filed additional motions accusing me of obsessive behavior, citing Renee's testimony to support his claims. Fighting to keep my daughter safe meant missing a critical quarterly appointment with the only pediatric diabetes specialist in the area. The missed visit was entered into court records as a mark of neglect. Every time I chose the truth, I lost a piece of credibility as a parent. 3 months of legal bills emptied my savings. I maxed out my credit cards, while Renee's defamation defense campaign raised over $30,000. The hospital community had circled the wagons. Comments on her fundraiser called me entitled, a vindictive parent trying to ruin a hardworking nurse's life. The imbalance was crushing. I couldn't afford decent representation anymore. Then came the viral blow. Lila and I had gone out for ice cream after a rough appointment. I was finally giving her a moment of sweetness after so much medical trauma. And then Renee showed up, laughing with friends, sliding into the booth behind ours. A teenage server overheard a few tense words between us. She had type 1 diabetes herself and took to TikTok to recount the drama. Karen versus hero nurse was the caption. It got 2 million views. Comment sections erupted. Strangers dissected my character, called me unstable, dramatic, even dangerous. No one knew what had really happened that night. 5 years of volunteer service at the hospital vanished in a single email. They cited ongoing legal conflicts with staff. The position was quietly handed to Chloe, Amy's best friend. The message was clear: back Renee or be erased. Every effort I'd made to change the system from within was systematically dismantled. Temporary court orders gave Isaac the house. The judge pointed to the stability he could provide, while I, still under fire, was forced to move back into my childhood bedroom. Renee, meanwhile, had just been promoted to charge nurse. The hospital newsletter ran a glowing profile about her resilience in the face of false harassment allegations. She was framed as a survivor. I was recast as the storm. My mother's final intervention came over Sunday dinner. She asked me, pleaded with me to let it go, said Mia needed space to heal. Then she admitted something else. She'd been giving Isaac updates, positive reports about my mental state, hoping it would stop him from going after full custody. It wasn't protection, it was betrayal, cloaked in concern. She said I was destroying the family again, just like after Dad died. What she didn't understand was that I had destroyed something, but not a family. I had destroyed a lie. In trying to prove Renee's pattern, I triggered an investigation that caught someone else in the crossfire. Madison, a young nurse fresh out of training, had been mentored by Renee. When her documentation was reviewed, it showed the same protocol violations, the same bad habits. She broke down in tears during her suspension hearing. She said she had just been doing what Renee taught her. I hadn't just exposed a broken system, I'd shattered a young woman's career to do it.
Madison's fiancé's family wanted nothing to do with the hospital scandal. Their engagement ended just weeks after her suspension. She took to social media, posting a raw message about how she'd lost everything because of one vindictive parent who couldn't move on. The hospital community immediately circled around her. I was no longer just a nuisance, I was now seen as a destroyer of innocent lives. Still, I kept gathering evidence, justifying Madison's downfall as collateral damage in a fight to prevent future victims. Then, the hospital chaplain, Mark, reached out. He'd counseled me during those sleepless nights in the PICU when I clutched Lila's hand and begged machines to keep her alive. He asked to meet. Mark spoke softly, but his words cut deep. He asked about forgiveness, about letting go, about whether Lila had survived not to fuel a revenge campaign, but to teach me about grace. I walked out before the conversation ended. I couldn't listen to wisdom that challenged my pursuit of justice. Not yet. Then came the deposition. Opposing counsel presented something I hadn't prepared for. Security footage. 2 clips. One of me moving my car, the other of me walking back inside with a coffee. They claimed I had abandoned my critically ill child. My explanation about paying a parking meter, about needing a minute to stay awake, fell flat. They reframed the entire narrative. I wasn't a vigilant mother, I was a negligent one, projecting blame. But it was the discovery phase that revealed the deepest wound. I'd first noticed Lila's symptoms at 6 a.m. that morning, but I didn't bring her to the ER until after a mid-morning work presentation. 6 hours. 6 hours lost because I'd prioritized my career. Renee's lawyer seized on this like a hawk. If I had taken Lila in immediately, she argued, Renee wouldn't have even been on shift yet. The crisis wouldn't have happened at all. Then came the emergency motion. Sharon's team filed to accelerate the trial date, citing what they called my escalating harassment. They pointed to the senior center, the gymnastics facility, even the social media posts I'd made in vague reference to her. My attorney was in Hawaii for his daughter's wedding. I was left with an associate who had never handled a medical malpractice case. The judge granted the motion. Trial would begin in 2 weeks, not 2 months. Renee's deposition painted a different woman than the one I'd confronted in the ER. She spoke with conviction. 20 years managing her mother's diabetes, countless extra shifts to afford her mother's in-home care. Nursing, she said, wasn't just a job, it was who she was. She was eligible for retirement, but stayed on, because she believed in it. And then I crossed a line I swore I never would. I told Lila we needed to stop by the hospital gift shop. While we were there, I used her presence, her innocence, to gain access to shift information from a sympathetic employee. The woman thought she was helping a mother manage her child's care, but I was using my daughter as bait for intel. At that moment, the transformation was complete. I had become what Renee's lawyer described in court papers, a manipulative stalker, willing to use any tactic to destroy a nurse just trying to do her job. The facts of that night no longer mattered. What mattered was who I had become. Each step I had taken to reveal Renee's errors now reflected my own unraveling. And then, from the least expected place, more truth surfaced.
Renee's teenage daughter, Brooke, had begun confiding in her father during supervised visits at the gymnastics center where Lila took classes. She mentioned her mom's recent forgetfulness, confusion at home. She'd found pages of medical notes, glucose protocols copied and recopied, like her mother was trying to relearn things she used to know. I documented those comments, every word from Brooke, another puzzle piece, more evidence, but it came wrapped in a child's pain. Then came the restraining order hearing. It was held at the Children's Hospital of all places. Isaac showed up with fresh custody paperwork, capitalizing on timing like a man who'd been waiting to strike. We presented our cases in a glass-walled conference room that overlooked the pediatric ward. During a break, I found myself standing beside Renee, both of us facing the memorial wall. Photos of children lost to preventable medical mistakes stretched across it. She had tears in her eyes. So did I. She told me she'd lost a cousin to misdiagnosed diabetes. I told her I'd lost my father to medical negligence. We were two women, shaped by medical trauma, inflicting new wounds in the name of past pain. But court didn't care about emotional mirrors. Renee's countersuit gained serious ground. The judge noted a pattern, my infiltration into Renee's world, her workplace, her mother's gym class, her daughter's school. The perception was no longer one of a mother seeking justice. It was a portrait of obsession.
What I had viewed as thorough investigation, the court began labeling as stalking. My meticulous spreadsheets, the time-stamped photos, the color-coded timelines, all of it was reframed as evidence of obsession. Instead of a mother fighting for answers, I was painted as a woman spiraling into fixation. Everything now hinged on one person, the traveling nurse who'd worked that night. I had spent weeks combing through shift records, triangulating agency rosters, and analyzing internal schedules. Finally, I found her, a float nurse named Patricia. She'd been rotating through the ER during Lila's crisis. Getting her subpoenaed required hiring a process server and tracking her current assignment, which turned out to be 3 states away. Strangely, an act of kindness I'd nearly forgotten gave me unexpected leverage. Months earlier, I'd helped Renee's mother after she slipped and fell at the senior center. I'd driven her home, made sure she got inside safely, and even checked on her the next morning. I hadn't expected anything from it. But now, her granddaughter Brooke, the teenager caught in the middle, asked me, "Why are you being so mean to Mom's friend? She helped Grandma." Her innocent question underscored how tangled the web had become. In my pursuit of justice, I had inadvertently embedded myself deep in the family's ecosystem. The hospital was fracturing. Politics split along generational lines. The nursing union stood firmly behind Renee, defending one of their own. But younger staff had begun whispering doubts about their training, about shortcuts they'd been taught. The pediatric ward was divided. Some saw me as a relentless advocate for patient safety. Others viewed Renee as a dedicated nurse being sacrificed by a system that failed to support her. My attorney broke it down bluntly. Civil court didn't require proof beyond a reasonable doubt, just a preponderance of evidence. But juries were often emotionally swayed, especially by long-serving nurses. Renee's background, her long hours, her financial strain, her caregiving responsibilities made her sympathetic. I, on the other hand, looked like a well-off parent coming after a working-class woman who dedicated her life to service. Desperation drove me to call in old favors. NICU nurses who remembered me from Lila's premature birth years earlier were willing to write statements. Back then, I'd insisted something was wrong despite normal results, and I'd been right. Early intervention had saved her life. These nurses vouched for my instincts, my calm under pressure, and my credibility as a parent with medical understanding. But none would testify directly against Renee. Union loyalty still reigned. Yet in their statements, they revealed something devastating. Lila had coded not once, but twice during that night in the PICU. I had only been told about the first incident. The second code occurred while I'd been asleep in that chair beside her bed, utterly unaware. While I slept, nurses had rushed to save my daughter's life a second time. It cemented the truth. This wasn't paranoia. This was experience.
I had intervened 3 times in 4 years to correct medical errors that could have cost Leela's life. I hadn't imagined a pattern. I'd lived through it. Then Patricia, the traveling nurse, finally responded to the subpoena, voluntarily. Her written statement confirmed it. That night, Renee had seemed confused. She'd asked Patricia fundamental questions about diabetes protocols, things any seasoned nurse should have known without hesitation. Patricia wrote that Renee had seemed unsure, but pushed forward anyway, too overwhelmed or maybe too proud to admit what she didn't know. A disturbing pattern emerged. Renee's errors consistently clustered during high-pressure shifts. Her behavior suggested cognitive decline under stress, something the hospital had never screened her for. Despite prior incidents, no evaluations had been ordered. No one wanted to open that door. The union's protections had made sure of that. My strategy evolved. I shifted the focus from personal blame to systemic responsibility. Instead of proving malice, I demanded competency testing for all emergency staff, especially those in high-risk roles. And then, a crucial detail emerged during Renee's deposition. She didn't chart patient information in real time. She filled out her notes at the end of her shift, hours later. This practice, common in overworked hospitals, explained the timeline discrepancies in Leela's records. Renee believed she had done everything correctly because she wrote it that way after the fact. Her memory had filled in the blanks with false certainty. It wasn't just error. It was a system built on unverified recall. As the arbitration hearing approached, both sides prepared for war. But the stakes had outgrown us. The hospital now feared a precedent-setting trial. If mandatory cognitive testing became policy, dozens of senior nurses would be affected. Long-serving staff with spotless reputations could face re-evaluation. The union couldn't afford to lose this case. Neither could the hospital. I presented my evidence calmly at the preliminary arbitration sessions, not out of composure, but because I was finally clear on what this fight was really about. It had never been just about Renee. It was about a system that quietly absorbed its mistakes and demanded silence from anyone who saw too much.
My shift, from vengeful mother to advocate for patient safety, unsettled Renee's legal team. They had constructed their entire argument around the image of an unhinged, obsessive parent. But now, every composed statement I made, every professionally formatted exhibit I presented, chipped away at that narrative. Their portrayal of me began to unravel. Mine began to solidify. The data told its own story. Renee's errors weren't sporadic. They followed a pattern. They clustered during high-stress shifts, particularly double shifts or after covering for others. It was a predictable breakdown under institutional strain. In truth, the system had failed her, just as she had failed Lila. Hospitals had been stretching aging nurses to their limits, stacking impossible workloads on exhausted bodies and minds. Renee hadn't been the only one pushed past her threshold. She'd been left vulnerable, and in turn made others vulnerable too. The final arbitration hearing approached with both sides sharpening their arguments. Only one of us would walk away with professional integrity intact. The conference room was full. Administrators, union reps, patient safety consultants. 50 hospital staff members packed the space. Nurses, physicians, supervisors, all forced to choose a side, whether they admitted it or not. The breakroom loyalties that once simmered in private were now being dragged into public view. The atmosphere was electric, tense. I laid out my evidence, calm and exacting. The documents, the protocols, the statements. No outbursts, no accusations, just facts. Renee sat across from me, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she sifted through her notes. Around her, the room's divides became visible. Older nurses sat beside her in solidarity. Younger nurses clustered together, eyes darting between me and the projector screen. Then came the NICU letters. The arbitrator's expression shifted as she read the lines about Lila coding twice during that ER visit. Renee went visibly pale. She hadn't known. Her attorney objected, but the medical records backed me.
2 near-fatal events in one night, both tied to one error. A single dosage misstep that had nearly taken my child's life. Twice. I saw heads turn, nurses exchanging quiet, uneasy glances. My next point landed hard. I had caught life-threatening medical mistakes 3 times in Lila's short life. I wasn't hysterical, I was experienced, and every time I had been right. Then I presented Patricia's written statement. The traveling nurse had documented exactly what I feared most. Renee had asked fundamental questions during Lila's crisis. Questions like, does high blood sugar cause vomiting? Is fruity breath a sign of low or high sugar? These weren't advanced medical riddles. They were textbook signs of diabetic ketoacidosis, the kinds of things any ER nurse should respond to instinctively. Patricia had originally assumed Renee was quizzing her, but reading her statement aloud made it clear. Renee hadn't been testing. She'd been unsure. She'd been confused. The statement continued. Renee showed uncertainty about insulin types and seemed unfamiliar with the progression of type 1 diabetic emergencies. She'd spoken as someone who had managed stable adult-onset diabetes, routine blood sugar checks, mild fluctuations. But pediatric type 1 crises? She wasn't equipped, and her pride or panic had prevented her from admitting it. I watched something shift in Renee's face. A realization. A collapse. Her expertise, 20 years of it, was real but limited. Built on managing her mother's type 2 diabetes. Built on structure, not chaos. It hadn't prepared her for a screaming child vomiting in her mother's arms, for fruity breath and glassy eyes, for blood sugar over 480. She believed she was capable, but she hadn't been. The arbitrator called a recess. In the hallway, I overheard the union representatives. Some were furious, desperate to shield Renee. Others, younger, quieter, were terrified. What if defending Renee now meant future liability when it happened again? The nurses were splintering. Reform versus reputation. Systemic risk versus institutional loyalty. Then something happened I hadn't anticipated. Renee's mother arrived. With Lila. Isaac had arranged it, clearly thinking that Lila's presence might throw me off or trigger an emotional reaction. But something different happened. As Renee's mother fumbled with her glucose monitor, arthritis slowing her fingers, I instinctively helped. I tested her sugar, talked her through the steps. Our mutual experience, our shared reality of daily management, briefly connected us. Renee saw it, all of it. Tears filled her eyes. She saw what I saw. 2 families being devoured by the same machine. Her mother dependent on her income. My daughter dependent on safe and competent care. Neither of us could win without the other losing something we couldn't afford to lose. The afternoon session hit a nerve for everyone. The arbitrator reviewed timestamps from Renee's patient charting. The records revealed that she updated her notes hours after interactions, not in real time. Nurses around the room looked down at their shoes. They knew. They'd done it too. Renee hadn't forged records out of malice. She'd done what exhausted nurses did, reconstructed the night from memory. But memory fails. And in her case, memory created a false narrative of competence. IT verified the logins. Renee had accessed and edited patient files hours after she should have. She hadn't intentionally deceived anyone. She'd simply believed what she later wrote down. It wasn't criminal. It was common. And it was dangerous. Renee had genuinely believed her reconstructed memories were accurate. The habit of post-incident charting, filling in notes long after the fact, wasn't just an oversight. It was a normalized behavior, forged by years of impossible workloads and chronic understaffing. That night, she'd worked a 16-hour shift, no breaks, no relief, covering for 2 absent colleagues while juggling critical patients. An aging nurse pushed far past her cognitive limits. 50 people sat shoulder to shoulder, watching 2 women publicly dissect one of the worst nights of their lives. It felt less like a hearing and more like a soul-bearing courtroom drama, equal parts tragedy and cautionary tale. No one was walking out of that room unscarred. Her mistakes, so obvious in hindsight, were the result of a system designed to fail. They weren't just predictable, they were inevitable. And then came testimony no one expected. Renee's mother took the stand. She admitted, with trembling hands, that her daughter had experienced confusion spells after long shifts. She'd begged her to retire, but they needed the money for home care, medications, basic survival. The arbitrator asked for examples. Her voice cracked as she described finding Renee in the kitchen, staring blankly at pill bottles, unable to recall dosing protocols she'd followed for decades. It wasn't just fatigue. Something was wrong. Then the courier arrived, bearing the results of Renee's neurological evaluation. Her attorney objected, but the arbitrator allowed the documents. Mild cognitive impairment. Not full dementia, but a documented decline in working memory and processing speed, worsened by stress and exhaustion. The kind of decline that turns routine into risk. Renee broke down. She hadn't known. The moments of blankness, the repeated notes, the gnawing sense of something slipping, it had all seemed like part of getting older. Nothing alarming, nothing worth reporting. But now she understood, and it devastated her. The union reps sat stunned. How many of their own, senior nurses who had served for decades, were silently struggling, afraid to retire, afraid to admit their minds weren't as sharp as they once were. The arbitrator ordered a review of ER staffing patterns. The data was damning. Senior nurses were regularly scheduled for back-to-back shifts. They covered multiple stations. They made life-and-death decisions under cognitive strain. The system didn't just allow these errors, it guaranteed them. When my lawyer presented our closing argument, it wasn't an attack on Renee, it was a plea for structural reform. Mandatory cognitive testing for emergency staff, limits on consecutive hours worked, double verification for pediatric cases, safeguards, not punishments, protection for patients and staff alike. Renee's team pushed back with brutal honesty. The hospital simply couldn't afford to implement those changes. Mandatory testing would force dozens of older nurses into early retirement, and with a nationwide shortage, there were no replacements waiting in the wings. Their argument was chilling. Better impaired care than no care. They painted me as entitled, a parent with resources demanding perfection from a crumbling infrastructure. They claimed I didn't understand the real cost of my demands. That's when the union split open. The younger nurses wanted reform. They saw cognitive testing as a safety net, not a threat. But the senior nurses saw it as a death sentence, forced retirement, financial ruin. It was generational warfare now, and it all played out in that crowded room. And then I did something unexpected, even to myself. I addressed the arbitrator directly. I proposed a compromise. Yes, implement testing, but don't discard those who fail. Reassign them. Shift them to roles where their experience could thrive. Medical records, patient education, administrative support. Keep their dignity. Protect the patients. Renee looked at me with something like gratitude, maybe even peace. The tension in her shoulders released. That compromise preserved everything that mattered. Her mother wouldn't lose care. My daughter wouldn't face another crisis alone. The hospital wouldn't spiral under another lawsuit. It wasn't justice, but it was progress. The arbitrator turned to Renee with one final question. What do you remember from that night? Her voice was barely audible. She couldn't say. The shift, the missing nurses, the impaired physician she'd covered for, it was all a blur. She'd filled in the blanks later, from habit. not memory. The administrators huddled. The cost of reform was daunting. Retraining, hiring, restructuring. But the alternative was more lawsuits, more injuries, more children lost. What once felt like a battle to avoid change now became a desperate attempt to control it. And in the middle of it all sat Isaac. He expected to see the woman he'd described in custody filings, furious, erratic, obsessed. Instead, he saw professionalism, measured language, reasonable compromise. With every document I shared, every solution I proposed, his claims unraveled. His argument for custody collapsed in real time. The final decision came down to one issue: the implementation timeline. The hospital pushed for 5 years to gradually phase in cognitive testing. I insisted on immediate action with a 1-year transition period. We settled on 18 months. Testing would begin immediately for all new hires and gradually phase in for current staff. Renee volunteered to be among the first tested. Her choice: she wanted to know, for herself, what she was still capable of. The outcome would determine her new role, but she would retain her pension and health care benefits either way. It wasn't the vindication I'd once imagined, but it was something far more important. It protected the next Leela. The arbitrator signed off on a new emergency protocol. From now on, all pediatric diabetic emergencies would require 2-nurse verification before medication was administered. Simple, immediate, life-saving. They called it Leela's Protocol, and Renee supported it publicly. Her endorsement carried weight, helping shift the minds of resistant staff still clinging to old routines. As we left the arbitration room, the fractures within the hospital were plain to see. Nurses clustered in small groups, whispering in hallways. Some were hopeful, others were bitter. Some saw the reforms as essential progress. Others saw age discrimination cloaked in safety language. The fight I'd started would outlive both of us. In the parking garage, Renee approached me. No words were spoken. Just a quiet look between two women who had both lost and gained more than they could name. Her career in emergency medicine was over. My place in the community was gone. But Leela would live, and other children would be protected. The custody battle changed overnight. Carl's witnesses had painted me as unhinged, but the arbitration transcript told a different story. A mother turning personal trauma into lasting reform. The judge maintained joint custody, noting that I had acted appropriately in advocating for Leela's safety. Emma reached out again, cautiously. Her transfer had been approved, but our friendship didn't survive. 20 years undone by career concerns. She apologized, but we both understood. Some betrayals can't be mended. Madison, the young nurse caught in the crossfire, reached out too. She'd found work at a clinic. She thanked me. My complaint, painful as it was, had forced her to confront unsafe practices she'd been taught. Now she was retraining the right way, becoming the kind of nurse Renee had never had the chance to be. Even the Facebook group changed. The dangerous parent alert post remained, but the comments began to shift. Some parents shared their own advocacy stories. Others admitted that maybe, just maybe, some difficult parents weren't wrong after all. Uncomfortable, but necessary. Hospital implementation started immediately. The first round of cognitive assessments showed what no one wanted to face. 15% of senior ER nurses showed measurable impairment when placed under stress. The union fought hard, but this time they fought for support, not silence. Our arbitration became the foundation for new negotiations. Renee transitioned to medical records role. Her decades of experience helped identify documentation gaps, training breakdowns, and subtle risks most systems overlooked. She found purpose again, not in treating patients, but in preventing the kinds of errors she had once made. Her mother's care continued, covered by her preserved benefits. Leela's quarterly appointments returned to normal. No more careful scheduling to avoid Renee. Sometimes we passed each other in the corridors. Quiet nods, no words. Two women forever linked by one terrible night. Neither of us got the justice we thought we wanted, but both of us helped give Leela what she needed. 1 year later, I was invited to join the hospital's Family Advisory Council. The woman once dismissed as a hysterical stalker was now recognized as the parent who changed everything. It wasn't redemption, but it was purpose, born of pain, and it worked. In the year following the reforms, not a single pediatric diabetic emergency involved a medication error. 3 near mistakes were caught through the new 2-nurse verification system. 3 children still alive because of one protocol. Other hospitals took notice. Some adopted the same policies, citing our arbitration directly. At the annual Hospital Safety Symposium, I found myself in the same auditorium as Renee. She presented on documentation standards. I spoke about advocacy. We didn't sit together, but our messages were aligned. Systems fail. People suffer. Change requires sacrifice. The war between us ended, not with triumph or defeat, but with a compromise forged in exhaustion and mutual recognition. Renee kept her dignity and her pension, but gave up her clinical role. I gained lasting reform, but lost my reputation and oldest friendship. Neither of us walked away unscathed. But Leela's protocol would save lives. In the end, we were both right, and we were both wrong.
Renee had made a fatal error, one rooted in a system that stretched her beyond her limits, and in personal blind spots she hadn't known she had. I had chased justice with such relentless intensity that I ended up fracturing innocent lives along the way. The truth was messier, harder, and more human than either of us wanted to admit. But Leela lived. And because of what we endured, other children will live too. That has to be enough.